Hello and welcome. My name is Alan and today we're doing more. A Testament of Hope, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Today we will be getting into a new section, books he has written. Part 5. We're only going to go through the first couple chapters here. They're not long, but trying to read a lot takes a while. So, let's hop into this. The name of the book is called Stride Toward Freedom. The blurb reads, with the help of the scholars such as George D. Keeley and Lawrence D. Reddick, the able editorial assistance of Hermione Popper, and the assistance of his staff, Dr. King was finally able to share and to reflect on the meaning of the Montgomery story with the American reading public. His book, Stride Toward Freedom, became the handbook of the movement. Scholars such as August Meyer are certainly correct to point out that the Congress on Racial Equality, as early as 1942, preceded Dr. King, and the SCLC in embracing nonviolent direct action as a tool to oppose segregation. Moreover, Dr. King himself indicated that he learned much from his prior nonviolent resistors, such as the Reverend Theodore J. Jameson of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who had led a successful boycott against that city's public bus system as early as 1953, and from the earlier attempts of the Reverend Vernon Johns, who preceded King as pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. Stride Toward Freedom served many purposes both for Dr. King and the civil rights movement. It was one of the first summaries of the motivations and objectives of a new and more militant generation of black leaders who saw no contradiction in aggressively pursuing black freedom. They were mainly young African Americans who were most impressed with the civic virtue and race loyalty of what E. Franklin Frazier called the old Negro middle class, and who did not feel called to sacrificial service to racial uplift for the sake of both race and their country. Frazier's rather polemical attack on the new Negro middle class sounded a powerful warning that something noble and historic was being subverted by rising commitment to materialism and parochialism within middle-class black America. Frazier declared among middle-class blacks. Frazier declared in 1957 that the separation of black people had produced a lack of responsibility among middle-class blacks. King himself complained about the political and social cynicism that gripped black ministers in particular. In his famous letter from Birmingham City Jail, he pinpointed where he stood in this struggle to capture the mind and the heart of the black middle class. I stand in the middle of two opposing forces in the Negro community. One is a force of complacency made up in part of Negroes who, as a result of long years of oppression, are so drained of self-respect and a sense of somebodyness that they have adjusted to segregation, and in part of a few middle-class Negroes who, because of a degree of academic and economic security, and because in some ways they profit by segregation, have become insensitive to the problems of the masses. The other force is one of bitterness and hatred, and it comes perilously close to advocating violence. He saw the Montgomery story and the triumph on his high road to destiny as a victory against these extremes. Return to the South, Chapter 1. On a cool Saturday afternoon in January 1954, I set out to drive from Atlanta, Georgia to Montgomery, Alabama. It was a clear, wintry day. The Metropolitan Opera was on the radio with a performance of one of my favorite operas, Donizetti's Lucia di Lammermoor. So with the beauty of the countryside, the inspiration of Donizetti's inimitable music, and the splendor of the skies, the usual monotony that accompanies a relatively long drive, especially when one is alone, was dispelled in pleasant diversions. After a few hours, I drove through the rich and fertile farmlands to the sharp bend in the Alabama River on whose shores Montgomery stands. Although I had passed through the city before, I had never been there on a real visit. Now I would have the opportunity to spend a few days in this beautiful little city, one of the oldest in the United States. Not long after I arrived, a friend took me to see the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where I was to preach the following morning. A solid brick structure erected in Reconstruction days. It stood at one corner of a handsome square not far from the center of town. As we drove up to the church, I noticed diagonally across the square a stately white building of impressive proportions and arresting beauty, the state capitol. The present building was erected in 1851, and its high-domed central portion is one of the finest examples of classical Georgian architecture in America. Here on the 7th of January 1861, Alabama voted to secede from the Union, and on the 18th of February, on the steps of the portico, Jefferson Davis took his oath of office as President of the Confederate States. It is for this reason that Montgomery has been known across the years as the cradle of the Confederacy. Here the first Confederate flag was made and unfurled. One could see many of the patterns of the old Confederacy and the antebellum tradition persisting in Montgomery today, alongside the lively evidence of modern economic development. I was to see this imposing reminder of the Confederacy from the steps of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church many times in the following years, for my visit in January proved to be a prelude to my coming to live in Montgomery. The previous August of 1953, after being in school 21 years without a break, I had reached the satisfying moment of completing the residential requirements for the PhD degree. The major job that remained was to write my doctoral thesis. In the meantime, I had felt that it would be wise to start considering a job so that I could be placed at least by September 1954. Two churches in the East, one in Massachusetts and one in New York, had expressed an interest in calling me. 3 colleges had offered me attractive and challenging posts. One a teaching post, one a deanship, and the other an administrative position. In the midst of thinking about each of these positions, I had received a letter from the officers of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church of Montgomery saying that they were without a pastor and that they would be glad to have me preach when I was again in that section of the country. The officers who extended me invitation had heard of me through my father in Atlanta and other ministerial friends. I had written immediately saying that I would be home in Atlanta for the Christmas holidays and that I would be happy to come to Montgomery to preach one Sunday in January. The church was comparatively small, with a membership of around 300 people, but it occupied a central place in the community. Many influential and respected citizens, professional people with substantial incomes, were among its members. Moreover, it had a long tradition of an educated ministry. Some of the nation's best trained Negro ministers had held pastorates there. That Saturday evening, as I began going over my sermon, I was aware of a certain anxiety. Although I had preached many times before, having served as associate pastor of my father's church in Atlanta for 4 years, and having done all of the preaching there for 3 successive summers, I was very conscious this time that I was on trial. How could I best impress the congregation? Since the membership was educated and intelligent, should I attempt to interest it in the display of scholarship? Or should I preach just as I had always done, depending finally on the inspiration of the Spirit of God? I decided to follow the latter course. I said to myself, keep Martin Luther King in the background and God in the foreground, and everything will be all right. Remember, you are a channel of the gospel and not the source. At 11 o'clock on Sunday, I was in the pulpit delivering my sermon before the large congregation. My topic was the 3 dimensions of a complete life. The congregation was receptive, and I left with the feeling that God had used me well, and that here was a fine church with challenging possibilities. Later in the day, the pulpit committee talked to me concerning my business details of the church and asked me if I would accept the pastorate in the event they saw fit to call me. After answering that I would give such a call my most prayerful and serious consideration, I left Montgomery for Atlanta, and then took a flight back to Boston. About a month later, I received an airmail special delivery letter from Montgomery telling me that I had been unanimously called to the pastorate of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. I was very happy to have this offer, and I did not answer immediately, for I was to fly to Detroit the next morning for a preaching engagement the following Sunday. It was one of those turbulent days in which the clouds hovered low, but as the plane lifted itself above the weather, the choppiness of the flight soon passed. As I watched the silvery sheens of clouds below and the deep dark shadow of the blue above, I faced up the problem of what to do about the several offers that had come my way. At this time, I was torn in two directions. On the one hand, I was inclined toward the pastorate. On the other hand, toward educational work. Which way should I go? And if I accepted a church, should it be one in the South with all the tragic implications of segregation, or one of the two available pulpits in the North? As far back as I could remember, I had resented segregation and had asked my parents urgent and pointed questions about it. While I was still too young for school, I had already learned something about discrimination. For 3 or 4 years, my inseparable playmates had been two white boys whose parents ran a store across the street from our home in Atlanta. Then something began to happen. When I was across the street to get them, their parents would say that they couldn't play. They weren't hostile. They just made excuses. Finally, I asked my mother about it. Every parent at some time faces the problem of explaining the facets of life to his child. Just as inevitably for the Negro parent, the moment comes when he must explain to his offspring the facts of segregation. My mother took me on her lap and began by telling me about slavery and how it had ended with the Civil War. She tried to explain the divided system of the South, the segregated schools, restaurants, theaters, housing, the white and colored signs on drinking fountains, waiting rooms, lavatories, as a social condition rather than a natural order. Then she said the words that almost every Negro hears before he can yet understand the injustice that makes them necessary. You are as good as anyone. My mother, as the daughter of a successful minister, had grown up in a comparative comfort. She had been sent to the best available school and college and had, in general, been protected from the worst blights of discrimination. But my father, a sharecropper's son, had met its brutalities firsthand and had begun to strike back at an early age. With his fearless honesty and his robust dynamic presence, his words commanded attention. I remembered a trip to a downtown shoe store with Father when I was still small. We had sat down in the first empty seats at the front of the store. A young white clerk came up and murmured politely, "I'll be happy to wait on you if you just move to those seats in the rear." My father answered, "There's nothing wrong with these seats. We're quite comfortable here." "Sorry," said the clerk, "but you'll have to move." "We'll either buy shoes, sitting here," my father retorted, "or we won't buy shoes at all." Whereupon he took me by the hand and walked out of the store. This was the first time I had ever seen my father so angry. I still remember walking down the street beside him as he muttered, "I don't care how long I have to live with this system. I will never accept it." And he never has. I remember riding with him another day when he accidentally drove past a stop sign. A policeman pulled up to the car and said, "All right, boy, pull over and let me see your license." My father replied indignantly, "I'm no boy." Then, pointing to me, "This is a boy. I'm a man, and until you call me one, I will not listen to you." The policeman was so shocked that he wrote the ticket up nervously and left the scene as quickly as possible. From before I was born, my father had refused to ride the city buses after witnessing a brutal attack on a load of Negro passengers. He had led the fight in Atlanta to equalize teachers' salaries and had been instrumental in the elimination of Jim Crow elevators in the courthouse. As pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, where he still presides over a congregation of 4,000, he had wielded great influence in the Negro community and had perhaps won the grudging respect of the whites. At any rate, they had never attacked them physically, a fact that filled my brother and sister and me with wonder as we grew up in this tension-packed atmosphere. With this heritage, it is not surprising that I had also learned to abhor segregation, considering it both rationally inexplicable and morally unjustifiable. As a teenager, I had never been able to accept the fact of having to go to the back of the bus or sit in the segregated section of a train. The first time that I had been seated behind a curtain in a dining car, I felt it was as if the curtain had been dropped on my selfhood. Having the usual growing boy's pleasure in movies, I had yet gone to a downtown theater in Atlanta only once. The experience of having to enter a rear door and sit in a filthy peanut gallery was so obnoxious that I could not enjoy the picture. I could never adjust to the separate waiting rooms, separate eating places, separate restrooms, partly because the separate was always unequal, and partly because the very idea of separation did something to my sense of dignity and self-respect. Now, I thought, as the plane carried me towards Detroit, I have a chance to escape on the long night of segregation. Can I return to a society which condones a system I have abhorred since childhood? These questions were still unanswered when I returned to Boston. I discussed them with my wife, Coretta. We had been married less than a year. To find that she too was hesitant about returning south. We discussed the all-important question of raising children in the bonds of segregation. We reviewed our own growth in the South and many advantages that we had been deprived of as a result of segregation. The question of my wife's musical career came up. She was certain that a northern city would afford a greater opportunity for continued study than any city in the deep south. For several days we talked and thought and prayed over each of these matters. Finally, we agreed that, in spite of the disadvantages and the inevitable sacrifices, our greatest service could be rendered in our native South. We came to the conclusion that we had something of a moral obligation to return, at least for a few years. The South, after all, was our home. Despite its shortcomings, we loved it as home and had a great desire to do something about the problems that we had felt so keenly as youngsters. We never wanted to be considered detached spectators. Since racial discrimination was most intense in the South, we felt that some of the Negroes who had received a portion of their training in other sections of the country should return to spare their broader contacts and educational experience in its solution. Moreover, despite having to sacrifice much of the cultural life we loved, despite the existence of Jim Crow, which kept reminding us at all times of the color of our skin, we had the feeling that something remarkable was unfolding in the South, and we wanted to be on hand to witness it. The region had marvelous possibilities, and once it came to itself and removed the blight of racial segregation, it would experience a moral, political, and economic boom hardly paralleled by any other section of the country. With this decision, my inclination toward the pastorate temporarily won out over my desire to teach, and I decided to accept the call to Dexter for a few years and satisfy my fondness for scholarship later by turning to the teaching field. I sent a telegram to Montgomery that I would be down in 3 weeks to discuss details. So I went back to Montgomery after exploring arrangements with the officers. I accepted the pastorate. Because of my desire to spend at least 4 more months of intensive work on my doctoral thesis, I asked for and was granted the condition that I would not be required to take up a full-time pastorate until September 1954. I agreed, however, to come down to Montgomery at least once a month to keep things running smoothly during the interim period. On a Sunday in May 1954, I preached my first sermon as minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and for the next 4 months, I commuted by plane between Boston and Montgomery. On my July trip, I was accompanied by Coretta. Montgomery was not unfamiliar to her, for her home was just 80 miles away in the little town of Marion, Alabama. There her father, Obie Scott, though born on a farm, had made a success in business, operating a trucking concern, a combination filling station and grocery store, and a chicken farm. Despite the reprisals and physical threats of his white competitors, he had dared to make a decent living for his family and to maintain an abiding faith in the future. Coretta had lived in Marion until she left to attend Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. Having inherited a talent for music from her mother, Bernice Scott, as well as the strength of quiet determination. She had then gone on, with the aid of a scholarship, to work her way through the New England Conservatory in Boston. It was in Boston that I had met and fallen in love with the attractive young singer whose gentle manner and air of repose did not disguise her lively spirit. And although we had returned to Marion on the 18th of June, 1953, to be married by my father on the Scots' spacious lawn, I was in Boston. It was in Boston that we had begun our married life together. So on the July visit, Coretta looked at Montgomery with fresh eyes. Since her teens, she had breathed the free air of unsegregated colleges and stayed as a welcome guest in white homes. Now, in preparation for our long-term return to the South, she visited the Negro section of town where we would be living without choice. She saw the Negroes crowded into the backs of segregated buses and knew that she would be riding there too. But on the same visit, she was introduced to the church and cordially received by its fine congregation. And with her sense of optimism and balance, which were to be my constant support in the days to come, she placed her faith on the side of the opportunities and the challenge for Christian service that were offered by Dexter and the Montgomery community. On the 1st of September 1954, we moved into the parsonage and I began my full-time pastorate. The first months were busy and the usual chores of getting to know a new house, a new job, a new city. There were old friendships to pick up and new ones to be made, and little time to look beyond our private lives to the general community around us. And although we had come back to the South with hope of playing a part in the changes we knew were on the horizon, we had no notion yet of how the changes would come about, and no inkling that in little more than a year we would be involved in a movement that was to alter Montgomery forever and have repercussions throughout the world. So yeah, those first two chapters kind of pick up on King's beginnings. He discusses his youth and even his wife Coretta Scott King's youth a bit. He discusses living in Boston and moving back to the South, to Alabama, where he had lived in Atlanta, Georgia when he was younger. He talked about how his family inspired him, how he looked at things and how it had inspired how he thought. But yeah, it's a pretty interesting start to the book. I enjoy it so far. I'll be honest. It's given a nice insight into the roots that set in to form who Dr. King was. But I'll continue in the next episode. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, later.